The marble staging area. Beneath the Capitoline hills, smells of cedar oil and old sweat. Outside, a sound rises that has no shape. 500,000 Romans pressed into the streets, their voices climbing the 7 hills like a tide. Inside, the air is cool. Slaves move in silence. A young woman stands at the center of the room with her arms held out from her sides, and a smith fits cuffs of polished gold to her wrists. The metal is warm from his forge. The chain that joins them is heavier than it looks. He kneels and fastens a second pair around her ankles. She is barely 20 years old. Her skin is the color of Egyptian honey. Her hair has been oiled and braided in the manner of a foreign queen. Outside, the crowd is calling for her by a name she has not used in months. They are waiting to watch her die. This is not a story about a Roman triumph. This is the story of the day Julius Caesar, the most calculating political mind in the ancient world, made a mistake he would not live long enough to understand. He had captured a princess. He had built a procession to break her. And when the moment came, in front of the largest crowd Rome had ever assembled, the city did something Caesar had not planned for. The city wept, and in weeping Rome rendered a verdict on its own future. Before we walk through the marble streets of Republican Rome on the day of Caesar's greatest spectacle, drop a comment below with your city and country. We want to know who travels with us into these vanished worlds. Hit subscribe and join Velours Spectre, where the dark elegance of forgotten centuries returns to you. You are watching Velours Spectre. In the year 46 before the Common Era, Rome was not yet an empire. It was still a republic, at least in name. But the institutions that had governed the Mediterranean for 4 centuries were collapsing under the weight of a single man. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, defeated Pompey at Pharsalus, and returned to a city that no longer knew how to refuse him. The Roman triumph was the oldest political theater in the Western world. The classicist Mary Beard, in her landmark study of the institution, describes the triumph as a ritual that fused religion, conquest, and humiliation into a single afternoon. A victorious general would lead his army through the streets in a slow procession that ended at the temple of Jupiter. He wore the purple. His face was painted red, like the cult statue of the god. Behind him walked the spoils of the war, looted gold, exotic animals, captured weapons, and at the end of the column walked the prisoners. The kings, the queens, the rebellious princes who had dared to oppose Rome. They walked in chains. They walked toward a small, cold prison at the foot of the Capitoline. And in that prison, after the cheering had ended, they were quietly executed. This was the contract. Rome saw the enemy, Rome cheered. The enemy disappeared. The Republic renewed itself through the ritual destruction of the foreign and the proud. Caesar in 46 BC was not satisfied with one triumph. He scheduled 4. Across 10 days, he intended to celebrate his victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. It was unprecedented. It was excessive. It was the kind of self-elevation that older Romans whispered about in private, and that younger Romans had begun to imitate. The city had never seen a man stage himself with such confidence. And no one, not Caesar, not the senators who watched him with sharpening unease, could yet imagine what would walk in chains through the second of those 4 triumphs. She was born in the palace at Alexandria in the closing years of the reign of her father, a king the Romans called Aulates, the flute player, for his musical pretensions and his desperate dependence on Roman money. The historian Duane Roller, in his biography of Cleopatra, places Arsinoe Fort's birth somewhere between 68 and 63 BC, the youngest of Auletes' daughters by an unrecorded mother. She was a Ptolemy. That meant something specific. The dynasty had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries by the time of her birth, and across those generations they had refined the practice of fratricide into a kind of family tradition. Brothers married sisters and then murdered them. Mothers poisoned sons. Aunts strangled nieces. The Ptolemaic family tree, when fully drawn, looks less like a tree than like a tightening noose. Arsinoe grew up inside that noose. She was educated in Greek philosophy and mathematics, in the astronomical sciences for which Alexandria was famous. She would have studied in the same library her ancestors had built, 3 centuries earlier, into the largest collection of human knowledge in the ancient world. She read Homer. She read Aristotle. She walked past the embalmed body of Alexander the Great on her way to dinner. Her older sister Cleopatra was already showing the political ferocity that would later make her famous. Her younger brothers were still children. Arsinoe was somewhere in the middle, old enough to be ambitious, young enough to be underestimated. And like every Ptolemy before her, she understood from childhood that the throne of Egypt was a prize worth killing for. Her family had taught her that by example every generation for 250 years. In the autumn of 48 BC, Julius Caesar landed at Alexandria with 4,000 men and the decapitated head of his rival Pompey waiting for him on a platter. He had not come to conquer. He had come to collect a debt. The Ptolemies had borrowed enormous sums from Roman creditors over the previous decade, and Caesar, newly victorious in the civil war against Pompey, intended to settle the accounts. What he found in the palace was a civil war of a different kind. Cleopatra, then 21, had been driven from court by her younger brother Ptolemy XIII and his advisors. The legend says she returned smuggled into Caesar's chambers wrapped in a carpet. The historian Joyce Tildesley has noted that the carpet detail comes from Plutarch and may be embellished, but the political maneuver beneath it is real. Cleopatra placed herself in Caesar's chambers, and within days she had placed herself back on the throne. Arsinoe was in the palace when this happened. She watched her older sister outmaneuver her in a single night. She watched the Roman general, middle-aged, balding, decisive, choose a partner from among the surviving Ptolemies, and she made a decision that would define the rest of her short life. She escaped. With the help of her tutor, a eunuch named Ganymedes, Arsinoe slipped out of the palace and into the streets of Alexandria, a city already filling with riot, with rumor, with the gathering rage of an Egyptian population that had no intention of being ruled by a Roman puppet. The Egyptian army encamped outside the city did not know what to do with a queen who had just been replaced. They needed a different queen. Arsinoe, age uncertain but no older than 17 or 18, walked into their camp and offered herself as that queen. They accepted her. They proclaimed her. And then, under the strategic command of Ganymedes, they declared war on Julius Caesar. The Alexandrian War lasted 6 months. Most modern textbooks compress it to a paragraph. The reality was a brutal urban siege fought across a city of marble and salt, in which a teenage princess held the legitimacy of Egypt against the most accomplished general Rome had ever produced. Ganymedes was Arsinoe's tactical mind, but the choices were hers. The Egyptian forces understood Alexandria better than the Romans did. They knew where the freshwater cisterns ran beneath the streets. Under Arsinoe's authority, those cisterns were poisoned with seawater, cutting off Caesar's drinking supply. Caesar himself, in his account of the war, records the moment his men realized the water was undrinkable and how close it came to breaking his army. The fighting moved to the harbor. The Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, became a contested fortress. Caesar's account survives. He describes leaping from a sinking ship into the water and swimming for his life, holding his cloak between his teeth so the Egyptians would not capture his standard. For a brief, vertiginous season, perhaps 3 months at the height of the conflict, it was genuinely possible that the Queen of Egypt was a teenage girl named Arsinoe IV, and that the man who would later become dictator of Rome was going to die in her harbor. But Ganymedes quarreled with the other Egyptian commanders. Reinforcements arrived for Caesar from the east, led by an ally named Mithridates of Pergamon. The decisive battle was fought at the Nile in March of 47 BC. The Egyptian army was crushed. Arsinoe's brother Ptolemy XIII drowned in the river while attempting to escape, his armor, weighed with gold, dragging him under. Arsinoe did not drown. The Romans found her in the chaos of the camp, and they took her alive. She was placed in chains. She was loaded onto a ship. The historian Adrian Goldsworthy notes that Caesar had a specific use in mind for her, one that required her body to remain intact, all the way across the Mediterranean. The voyage from Alexandria to Rome was not direct. Caesar lingered in Egypt for months, sailing the Nile with Cleopatra in a royal barge, while his prisoner remained in chains in the hold of a different ship. There is no surviving account of what Arsinoe did during those weeks. We know she was kept alive. We know she was not abused. Caesar's instructions on that point were clear, because what he intended to do with her required her to walk into Rome on her own feet, intact, unmistakable. She was eventually transferred to a transport ship and carried across the Mediterranean. The crossing in late summer of 47 BC would have taken 6 to 8 weeks, depending on winds. She would have been kept below deck. The historian Joyce Teldesley, working from the parallel cases of other royal captives, suggests that prisoners of her status were typically held in conditions designed to preserve their value as spectacle, bathed, fed, even given access to clean clothes, but never permitted to forget what was coming. What was coming was the triumph. She would have learned of it during the voyage. There is no way she would not have sailors talk, guards talk. Every Roman aboard the ship knew that the entire city was already preparing for the largest civic celebration in the history of the Republic. 4 triumphs, 10 days, a single general, and that the Egyptian triumph required a princess to walk in chains in front of 500,000 Romans. The princess was her. She arrived at Ostia in autumn of 47 BC and was transported, still in chains, to a holding facility in Rome. The next several months were the longest of her life. The triumph would not be held until the following summer. Caesar was busy in Africa fighting the last of the Pompeian holdouts. The princess waited. We do not know what she did in those months. We do not know if she was visited, if she was permitted to write, if she was given news from Egypt. We know she was kept alive. We know she was kept ready. This is the second climax of her story, and it is the quietest one. It is not a battle. It is not a confrontation. It is the slow psychological work of becoming a person who knows the date of her own destruction. The triumph was scheduled for late summer. She would walk in the second of the 4 processions, the Egyptian one, the day Caesar wished to humiliate the Ptolemaic dynasty in front of the city that funded its existence. According to Roman custom, a custom so old it had its own ritual name, the strangulation in the Tullianum, captured royal prisoners were executed at the conclusion of the triumph. They were taken from the procession into a small underground prison at the foot of the Capitoline hill. They were silenced there. Their bodies were dumped on the Gemonian stairs. This was what Caesar planned for Arsinoe. The Roman crowd would cheer her humiliation. The Tullianum would silence her. The Ptolemies would be reduced in a single afternoon to a footnote. She knew this. She had known it for months. By the time the first day of the triumph dawned over Rome, the Gallic triumph, 4 days before her own, she had been living with the date of her execution longer than most condemned prisoners in human history. And on the morning of the Egyptian triumph, when the smith knelt to fasten the chains around her ankles in the staging area beneath the Capitoline hill, she did not weep. The accounts agree on that. She did not weep at all. The Egyptian triumph began in the late morning. The procession formed at the Campus Martius and would move slowly, over the course of the entire day, along the Via Sacra, and up the Capitoline hill. Caesar would ride at its head in a chariot drawn by 4 white horses. His face would be painted red. A slave would stand behind him holding a golden wreath above his head and whispering, in the old ritual phrase, "Remember that you are mortal." Behind Caesar walked the spoils of Egypt. There were chests of gold. There were paintings carried on wheeled platforms, depicting the death of Pompey, the burning of the Egyptian fleet, the drowning of Ptolemy XIII in the Nile. There were captured weapons. There were exotic animals. There were placards, lifted on poles, listing in painted Latin the names of the conquered, and then there were the prisoners. Arsinoe walked near the front of the prisoner column, where she could be seen most clearly. She was not the only captive in the procession, but she was the centerpiece, the only Ptolemy ever displayed in a Roman triumph, the only sister of a sitting queen ever paraded as enemy. The chains on her wrists and ankles were heavy enough to slow her gait. Cassius Dio, the Roman historian who would later write the most detailed surviving account, records that the chains were of considerable weight. He records also that the procession moved at the pace of the slowest prisoner, and that the slowest prisoner was Arsinoe. The crowd had assembled hours before dawn. 500,000 Romans, give or take. They lined the streets 4 and 5 deep. They climbed onto roofs. They watched from the windows of every insula along the route. They had cheered, on the previous day, the Gallic triumph, the parade of long-haired barbarian warriors taken in the campaigns against Vercingetorix. They had cheered properly. They had jeered. They had thrown things. When Arsinoe came into view, the crowd did something else. The accounts agree on this. Cassius Dio records it. Appian, writing in the 2nd century, records it from older sources. The Roman crowd looked at the young woman walking in chains in the late summer sun, and they did not jeer. They did not throw things. They began to weep. Some of it was the chains. Some of it was the heat. Some of it was the unbearable specific fact of her youth, barely 20 years old, by most modern estimates, and small enough that the chains seemed disproportionate to her body. But most of it, the historians suggest, was something deeper. The Roman crowd had seen many triumphs. They had seen many royal captives. What they had not seen in living memory was a woman of their own approximate age and bearing, Greek-speaking, educated, recognizably aristocratic, reduced to a shuffling figure in golden chains by the man they were supposed to be celebrating. The procession moved slowly along the Via Sacra. Caesar rode at its head. He could not see what was happening behind him, but he could hear it. He could hear what 100,000 wet voices sound like when they refuse to cheer. At the foot of the Capitoline, the procession halted. Caesar dismounted. He climbed the steps to the temple of Jupiter, performed the sacrifices, completed the ritual. The prisoners waited. Custom required that they now be taken into the Tullianum and silenced. Custom had not been broken in centuries. Caesar broke it. We do not know exactly when he made the decision. Some historians believe it came during the procession itself, when the sound of the crowd reached him. Others believe it came afterward, in private council. Mary Beard, in her study of Roman triumphs, frames it as a calculated retreat. Caesar realized that ending Arsinoe in the customary manner would not consolidate his power but corrode it. She had become, in the space of a single afternoon, more sympathetic than the dictator parading her. Arsinoe was not taken to the Tullianum. She was not returned to her cell. She was not killed. She was placed under Roman protection and sent, escorted, but alive, to the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, where she would be permitted to live as a refugee. She walked into the temple in the autumn of 46 BC. She believed, as the priests of Artemis believed, that no one in the ancient world would dare draw a blade on the steps of that altar. She would be safe there, forever. She was wrong. She lived in the temple at Ephesus for nearly 5 years. She was in her mid-20s when the world found her again. By that time, Cleopatra had outlived Caesar, who was assassinated in 44 BC by senators who had begun to suspect what the triumph crowd already knew. Cleopatra had aligned herself with Mark Antony, the surviving Caesarian commander, and Mark Antony in 41 BC sailed east to consolidate Roman power in Asia Minor. Cleopatra met him at Tarsus. She named her conditions. We do not know the exact words she used. We know the result. Antony dispatched soldiers to Ephesus. They climbed the marble steps of the Temple of Artemis. They violated the asylum that the ancient world had considered inviolable. And they ended Arsinoe forth on sacred ground in front of the goddess, on the orders of her older sister. Cleopatra would survive 11 more years before dying, in her own palace, by a method of her own choosing. Arsinoe would have no such choice. The classicist Mary Beard observed that every Roman triumph carried, hidden inside its choreography of dominance, a whisper of its own undoing. The slave behind the general murmured, "Remember that you are mortal." The crowd that cheered today might weep tomorrow. The prisoner in chains might become, in the city's memory, more sovereign than the man who dragged her through it. Caesar built the largest spectacle in Roman history to reduce a Ptolemaic princess to a footnote. He did not understand that humiliation performed at scale can curdle into pity, and pity into legend, and legend into a verdict that outlives the empire that staged it. He won the procession. He lost the city's heart. In the 1990s, the Austrian archaeologist Hilkethur proposed that an octagonal tomb at Ephesus, opened decades earlier, contained the remains of a young woman in her 20s, possibly Arsinoe herself. The tomb stands as it has stood for 2 millennia, within sight of the temple where she was killed. History, in the end, did not bury Arsinoe. It buried Caesar's calculation. Thank you for walking all the way to the end with us. If this story revealed how the cruelest spectacles in history sometimes carry the sentence that destroys their authors, subscribe, hit the like button, and share with someone who needs to see what a weeping crowd can do to an empire. You have just watched another premium documentary from Velours Spectre. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. The descent into the past continues.